Hey, welcome to another interview. This is Al McCarn, and today I get to travel electronically to the heart of Texas, Austin, Texas, where we get to talk with Dr. Gayle Timberlake of the Simca Foundation. Dr. Gayle, welcome to Reunion Roadmap.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Al. I know we've had great conversations leading up to this, and I'm just delighted to get to know you, what you do, and to be here on your show today. So thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, now let me just say I am amazed at looking over your bio because you're one of those people. I wonder, how does she do this in one lifetime? You're a PhD. You have been to school in Oxford, England, and in Israel. You have been part of the United Nations, part of the U.S., I assume, State Department.
Actually, I was on the board of directors for an NGO with the United Nations. That's how I ended up there. And I ended up in DC for other reasons. A lot of that was lobbying for Israel.
Well, good. We need more people like you. And you're a fifth generation Texan.
I am.
All right. Well, can we just get some of the Gayle Timberlake story, as in, how did you get from Texas to Washington, New York, Oxford, Jerusalem? How did that happen?
Yeah, I love the question. My dad was one of those big, tall Texans, and he would always wonder, why do you need to go anywhere else? Everything you need is here in Texas. So I was a bit of the renegade. I went to undergraduate school here in Texas. I went to Lubbock. So I was at Texas Tech in Lubbock. Get your guns up. And then ended up in Dallas working downtown in banking for a year and a half, and then straight to Austin, to the capital, where I worked downtown next to the governor's mansion and had a lot of interaction with the state capitol. Lived in Austin, did a lot in Austin for 6 years. Built up the museum, the art museum, and other things here in Austin. And then found myself in Florida, and that's where the adventure began. So I had one foot in business much of my life, since my undergrad is in communications and business, but always had this yearning to learn more about my faith. And so I ended up from Florida launching and going to school to get my master's at a theological college to learn more about the origins of my faith, and it kind of went on from there.
Hmm. Well, okay, so did I hear that right? You went to Florida to your master's degree. Where'd you go to school, I wonder?
Yeah, I actually was in Florida for a church planting project, but I went to Pittsburgh, actually in between the two, to go get my master's. So I was at Trinity School for Ministry right outside of Pittsburgh.
Mhm.
And I happened to have an Old Testament professor who loved Israel and spent much of his time there. He taught at the theological school at Trinity, but he really spent his time between Cambridge, England, and Israel. And he taught me things about Israel and about the foundation of the faith of Christianity that I had been missing in my understanding. I grew up knowing a lot of what I learned in church, but I didn't know about the Hebrew side of this Christ that I followed, who was truly a rabbi, a Middle Eastern rabbi. And so he opened my eyes to that reality. And I started going back and forth to Israel at that point to live for periods of time and to study. So I studied at Jerusalem University College and went all throughout Greece and Turkey and stayed in Israel, just wanting to touch every bit of the land, from the north and the snow and Mount Hermon all the way to the desert. I just wanted to know so much about this faith that I wasn't taught, about that cultural heritage that I found was so intriguing. And also, it fed my faith and expanded my understanding of the relationship that I had with Jesus, who I had already come to love and know, but I didn't know him as Yeshua of history. I knew him as Jesus of the Bible. And so learning who he was in his cultural context began a journey for me that has been added to and has built until here I am teaching people about the cultural context of Jesus.
That cultural context is so important. I have a good friend who says when he was one of the first times, maybe the first time he was in Israel, and he's at the Kotel and he is seeing these Orthodox men praying at the wall, and it hit him. He said, I knew that Jesus was a Jew. I didn't realize Jesus was Jewish. And so so that took you let's see, Texas, Florida, Pittsburgh, over to Oxford. Why Oxford?
Yeah, I grew up in the Anglican tradition. And so Wycliffe College was always of interest to me. We have in the English version of the Anglican tradition here in America, we have Episcopalians, but ties to England were always really strong. And so I thought if I had the opportunity, I would love to study some in that area of the world. And just opened my eyes up to whole new worlds. One of which was that summertime is one of the coldest winters I ever spent because summer is very cold in England. So I had an umbrella with me for the rain and a coat with me for the warmth. But yeah, what an amazing experience that was, though, to be able to walk on the streets, especially where C.S. Lewis was and the Inklings and that whole crew. So that was an important part of my journey that opened my eyes to even knowing the British side. My family comes from that line. And so when I later lived in South Africa, where there is a large British community and influence, it was very helpful because I was already very much accustomed to afternoon tea, and it suited me quite well. So yeah, I love that.
So I must ask, were you in Bloemfontein?
I actually went through Bloemfontein once. You sound like you have some history with Bloemfontein.
Well, yes, because the next question is, did you visit Tolkien's birthplace?
I went by it. I did not stop and visit it, but what a great question. I knew it was there, and it sounds like perhaps you may have.
Well, I have not had the blessing of visiting South Africa yet, but I have been to Tolkien's grave in Oxford.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah.
And also had a pint with friends at the Eagle and Child.
Good. Well, it's right one of those things.
Yes.
Yeah, I went through Bloemfontein because I finished my PhD in South Africa in Potchefstroom, which is south of Johannesburg. And one weekend there was an opportunity to speak at a university in Stellenbosch, which is near Cape Town. So the distance between those two cities where I would have left would be near Johannesburg to the Cape Town area. Was an easy flight, but I had some fellow students who asked me to do the drive with them. And I thought, well, it's a 17-hour drive. I don't know if I can sit still that long. It's really hard for me when I fly internationally. I'm usually up walking the whole time, and I fly internationally a lot. So I said, we'll do it this way. I'll drive down and fly back. So I drove down with them. We went through Bloemfontein, and that's how I know about it. And had the most interesting 17-hour drive straight, didn't stop. It was really amazing. And we decided to stop at a winery in Stellenbosch on the way down and have wine tasting. Well, in South Africa, wine tastings are not quite like other wine tastings I've been to, in that you drink quite a bit of each wine to be able to get a real taste of it. So that by the time I got to where I needed to be to speak at an event at the university in Stellenbosch. It was kind of a party in the room during the time I was talking, but we had a great time there anyway.
Sounds like it. Yeah.
That's great.
Well, let's talk about the Simca Foundation.
I'd love to. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the flyer that you shared with me of the Reclaim Your Cultural Biblical Heritage Inheritance mini course. And I just want to read the first paragraph here because this got my attention. It says, "Welcome to your family heritage. Many Christians feel disconnected from the culture that links them to the origins of their faith. More than physical distance or millennia, it's the cultural difficulties that separate us from Jesus and the world of the Bible." Okay, I know where you're coming from because that, what you just said, that was part of my journey.
Mhm.
So, what is the Simca Foundation? What inspired you to start it?
Yeah, I can relate to you saying that. Simca Foundation, we really call it a ministry of joy and rest. Why? Because many of us in the world are lacking joy and are desperate for rest, especially over these last 2 years. And there's a key or a secret to that inheritance that you mentioned that satisfies both an increase in rest and the need for joy. And here's what I mean. You know, as Christians, we love Jesus, right? Like we know that he is our all in all. We know that with the infilling of the Holy Spirit, we can be led through the most difficult periods of life and also be led to know what to do next. And so it's imperative for all of us. At the same time, here in America, we live our Christian life much different than much of the world. And that was emphasized to me in these places that I visited and lived. In South Africa, the first weekend I was there, a Christian group asked me if I would come speak at their Friday night Sabbath gathering dinner. And I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? I didn't grow up in America where Christians gathered for that event. And so that was eye-opening to me. And of course, in Israel, Christians live in a different way than we do, in that the weekly time of rest is front and center. And so one of the things that we've realized at the Simca Foundation is the need to re-educate us on our family history. We're the younger kids that got grafted into a big family. The older kids, if you will, know a lot more about the family than we do. And so we're the new kids coming in and we have a lot to learn. And so one of the products that we came up with is a guide that actually walks people through the year, week by week and month by month, in the viewpoint of the first Christians, how they understood each week, how they understood each month, how they celebrated seasons that first century Christians celebrated that were on the calendar of Jesus. And so that is the first product that we came up with, is just this beautiful guide. It has gold annotated rings. You can take pages in and out. And we, after the purchase of a Shabbat guide, you receive in the mail quarterly updates that you press in so that you have more of the year as you go along. So we're really big on staying in touch with people that have partnered with us in whatever way with Simca Foundation. And so we love to stay in touch, and that's one of the ways we stay in touch. So one of the goals of Simca Foundation is to reintroduce Christians to their inheritance that's been either lost, stolen, forgotten. You can say what you want. Probably a little bit of all of them are true. And so we get to relearn those things and be fully into the culture of the family that we got grafted into. So that's one of the first things that we've done at Simca Culture. Well, we call it Simca Culture actually, but part of Simca Foundation is reintroducing us to the rest that's always been ours, that we've forgotten about, through a guide, a manual, a booklet, a beautiful kind of a leather-bound booklet called the Shabbat Guide.
Mm.
We have several other things that we've created too. But yeah, so that's the first thing, is to teach about rest. The other thing that we want to teach about is joy. So joy comes through seasonal events that happen at different times of the year. There are seasonal events that happen in the fall that are part of our inheritance as Christians, and seasonal events that happen in the spring that are part of our inheritance as Christians. And then a couple of other events through the year too. So the Shabbat Guide not only is not the only thing that teaches about those. We can learn about those celebratory events, but we also created a box. So we call a box that we came up with Festival in a Box, that gets delivered to your door. And when you open it up, you hold a piece of Israel that's actually tied to the celebration season that you're currently in. So you can hold part of Israel in your hand that explains the celebratory events that are on the calendar when you receive it. So those are two things that we're doing through Simcha Foundation, in addition to an app. So an app that will have lots of teachings to teach like the things that we've been missing. And we're really starting from the beginning, trying to make complex concepts and ideas simple for us to step into at home with our family and friends, and just start the peace and start the rest and start the joy celebrations. So that's a little bit of an intro about the Simcha Foundation.
Yes. And as you said, Simcha means what?
Joy.
Joy.
Yeah. So Simcha means joy. There's several Hebrew words that mean joy, and Simcha is one of them. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So before I forget, would you give our listeners your website?
Yeah. So you can find simchafoundation.org. And Simcha, we spell a really simple way, and it's SIMKA. So there's a S that starts that like in Sam, I M like in Mary, K like in kite, A. simchafoundation.org.
Simchafoundation.org. Now, 20 years ago, this would have been very useful for my wife and me, because when, like so many others, the Lord just says, all right, there are things you have missed in the scriptures, pay attention. And I was looking at, okay, there's tabernacles, there's the Feast of Dedication, there's Passover, and where do I start? So it was through self-study of the scriptures and then just hunting online for resources. And thank God we had a Messianic Jewish synagogue just 20 minutes from our house. So we were members there for 5 years and learned so much. But I take it that what you've got envisioned, let me ask if this is correct. You're thinking of the typical Christian, Methodist, Baptist, Anglican, who's realizing there's something more and wonders, how do I find out, and what applies to me? Is that the person you're looking to help?
Absolutely. Those that know nothing about it. So I had an incredible experience where I started a household myself many years ago, before children. And I was wondering, how is it that I establish a home that has traditions that are really tied to Jesus and really tied to the faith that I was in? And I was struggling to figure out, well, how would that actually work? So I thought back, well, how did the disciples do it? And I realized that they would have sat around a breakfast table and a dinner table with parents and grandparents who would talk about what was happening on the biblical calendar that would be front and center for them at the moment. Because the faith of Jesus is one that remembers, always remembers what happened at this time. And so the art of remembering is huge. And so how could then now in this day and age, I wanted to realize, how could that happen now? And what I did realize is that the traditions of Jesus, they're timeless. And so how could we reinstitute the timeless traditions of Jesus in my personal household, and to help other parents who wanted to follow a path that would match more the earliest believers and how they lived life? And I realized that for myself, it was a personal study, and going through a master's, and that where I started to learn more. And then I went and got my PhD in Second Temple Judaism, really surrounded around the customs and traditions of the earliest Christians. And then I had an unlikely opportunity to be mentored by a fifth generation Orthodox Jewish rabbi who came from the traditions of straight from Israel, and learn more and more and more and more as I went along. So living in Israel, having a mentor as an Orthodox rabbi gave me a look at it that really didn't come from what we've learned over the years through Christianity and church history, but really more like what we've seen through Jewish history over the years, expressed through my experience as a believer in Jesus and the Holy Spirit and the Trinity and the Father. So that's really where I come from, is trying to explain and make really simple what is not so simple to try to figure out for Christians. It's not an easy road to try to figure it out. And so what we've done is begun to create products and teachings that make it easy to figure out, so that you can bring those traditions into your home and begin to celebrate and begin to have the rest and the joy that are part of our inheritance.
It's a fascinating journey. And I just wonder, Gayle, I call it the Torah awakening among Christians. And it's been going on now. We're in the second generation, I suppose. What do you think the Lord is doing in the church worldwide at this time? And also in the Jewish body worldwide, what is he doing now to increase this awareness and this openness for crosstalk?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. I had a meeting just this week with the former president and CEO of the Jewish Community Center here in Austin, and we have a lot of these conversations. What's happening in the Jewish world worldwide, and what's happening within those believers in Jesus worldwide? What I know is that the Lord is starting a movement where he is expressing an interest in believers in Jesus to know more about how to step into their full identity. What I believe is that through each celebratory season on the biblical calendar or the calendar that Jesus followed, say it however you choose, there is identity that's released in each festive season, and there's identity that's released in each weekly time of rest, and that there's an identity that's released so that people find out more about who they are. Why? Because the character of God is revealed in each one. And you can't help but find out more about who you are, your own identity, if the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords is revealing more of his character. So what happens is he reveals his character and we learn who we are. We gain our identity through each seasonal event that happens on the calendar. And I believe it's always intended to be that way. We've just had a long pause as Christians, and now it's time to start in again. You know, I started a project about 20 years ago. It was called Festival in a Box, and it was a version of the box that we're folding into Simcha Foundation now. And the idea was you would receive a box at your doorstep, you open it up, parents, whoever received it, grandparents, singles, whoever it was, take the things out of the box, look inside, and be able to celebrate the season at hand, to be able to participate in the biblical calendar. At that time, I had a lot of interest, and so I finally took the box to a publisher, and I said, I'm kind of interested in doing more than this, than a reach that I'm interested in pursuing. And so I thought I would give it to you, have you take a look at it. They crunched a bunch of numbers. I had a couple of publishers look at it. And one of them came back and they said, ma'am, you said this is a product. I said, it is a product. It's a box with everything that you need to celebrate the spring festival season on the calendar of Jesus. And they said, no, this is a movement. And I said, yes, it is a movement. It's not mine. I'm just jumping into and participating in the movement from heaven that's always been meant for us, that we've been missing. It's not an obligatory thing. It's not something you have to. It's not something that's required. It's like a get to. And so I'm just participating in the movement of Jesus. I'm participating in what the earliest Christians did and reteaching because I had the opportunity to live in and study and do research in this field and then turn it around and make it easy and fun. I've always been one for making everything really fun. And that's an easy thing to do with the calendar of the first century to make it really fun.
Well, that's true. Because most of it has to do with good food.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the illustrations that I often use is that if you picture one of the most beautiful banquet tables you've ever been to, the kind that holds hors d'oeuvres that's at the edge of the room, and it might have this beautiful ice sculpture in the middle that's been carved, and it might have chocolate flowing over here, and just the caviar and all the best. And how silly it would be for anyone to go up and grab a Ritz cracker and spread some Philadelphia cream cheese on it and leave. That would be ridiculous, right? Because the entire table is laid out and available and ready. And I feel like that with part of our heritage, the heritage that we haven't known as ours as Christians, the heritage of the faith system of Jesus, you could say our own personal inheritance. That's kind of what we've done. We've gotten a little bit of it. And I'm not saying we're missing things, because as Christians, if we have Jesus, we have the most important part. So don't misunderstand. When we have Jesus, we have everything. But there is more. And what the more does is it informs us more. And in that, as I mentioned before, we see more of the character of the Father, and we gain more of the understanding of who we are. So I think of the table a lot. Not only is it a really important and applicable description that relates to this faith that we got grafted into, but yeah, it's my illustration of the more that we have available to us.
Amen. To try to put this in a historical context, we think of Paul writing his letters to Rome and Philippi and Corinth, and he's writing to Christians who are already celebrating Christmas and worshiping on Sunday. But wait, seems to me these Greeks and Scythians and Romans and such who are receiving his letter, they're worshiping in the synagogue on Shabbat. They are celebrating Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, and they're not looking at themselves as something separate from the Judaism of the day. In fact, I read in Acts 25, when I think that's it, when Paul is making his defense, I believe, before King Agrippa, or at least in Caesarea, he says, they call us a sect of Judaism, like the Essenes, like the Sadducees, like the Pharisees. Gee, I never learned that growing up in a Baptist church. So that means my spiritual ancestor in Rome, for example, is having table fellowship with a Jewish family who follows Yeshua. And that's groundbreaking on both sides. So Gayle, this is where I want to ask about some of the bumps you have encountered along the way, because there's a continuity here. What we are experiencing today in the 21st century, believers, Jewish and non-Jewish, in the first century were also experiencing. Mm-hmm. So when you're talking to the rabbi there at the CJCC in Austin, what are some of the concerns he has about, here you come with your Jesus, and that has not been good for the Jewish people all this time? And are you appropriating what is ours? I'm sure you've encountered that. How do you address such a question?
Yeah, I love this question. I'm going to tail back to one of the things that you just said. It said that the early emperors could not tell the difference between the Jews and the Christians. And so Nero, for instance, and others persecuted both the Jews and the Christians, thinking that they were somewhat the same because they celebrate the same things. They're both doing Sabbath. They're both doing the biblical feasts. And there's really the emperors can't tell. They're looking from the outside, looking in and saying, they all look alike to me. Let's just persecute them all, right? These monotheistic people who believe there's only one God are anathema to the emperors at the time, who say, nope, if they're any monotheistic, the one God believers, yeah, they're totally not, they're the ones that go, right? So what's happening in the Jewish world? So one of the things I want to answer, two of the questions that you had, one of them is, within Judaism, we see anti-Semitism on the rise.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that the history of anti-Semitism from a Jewish standpoint is that it comes from Christians. There's really not much behind anti-Semitism in Jewish eyes coming from non-Christians. It's mostly the Christians that are the ones that are persecutors from Jewish eyes, and that's just the way it is. We would say different. We would say, well, Hitler wasn't really a Christian, but there's a lot to dispute that as well. So from Jewish eyes, it's mostly Christians. So if you think about it, one of our tasks is to call Jews to jealousy, right? These are our older brothers and sisters that get to look at us at some point and say, well, I don't know what it is that you have, but whatever it is, I want it. For right now, they're not even close to interested in us. There is nothing about Christians that make them say, wow, I'm really attracted to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what would cause that? Well, one of the things is Christians, because we know very little about the main things that Jews are very interested in. One of the main things is things that happen on a calendar. We know nothing about that as Christians. Good, bad, or in other, whatever you want to call that. We just don't know a lot about it. We don't really participate in it. And I believe that there's a sense in which there's a knowing that's missing within Christianity. When we know more about our brothers and sisters in the faith, we can have a better relationship with them. It's the same for any relationship. My best friend, for instance, or say I get a new best friend in the next week. If that's someone who I think is going to be a really good friend of mine, I'm going to want to find out, well, what's of interest to you? And they're going to find out, well, what's of interest to me? It's the same in any marriage, right? You pay attention to what is of interest of the other person, and they pay attention to what's of interest to you. This not only relates to our relationship with the Heavenly Father, for us to find out what's of interest to him, and for us to find out what's of interest to Jesus, we're going to find that the calendar and the scheduled events are right in there among things that are very top of mind, especially during those times of year. Mm-hmm. It's good for us to learn about those things, right? Because we're learning more about who God is when we learn those things. But I believe the same thing with the unity between Jews and non-Jews, and specifically Jews and Christians, for us to care enough to even know about the calendar that's so important to them. Mm-hmm. Is really important, I think. Now, can we be seen as those that are trying to steal it or usurp it? Perhaps, but you can tell pretty much what someone's intent is when you talk to them, can't you? Yes. You can tell if someone has ill intent toward you by talking to you. And I believe that Jews know that too. And I also believe that the understanding of the calendar of the first century among Christians will cause anti-Semitism to go down. Why? Because they're starting to learn more about this group of people that we have either not have an understanding about, or we have bits of anti-Semitism. It's amazing how anti-Semitism creeps through the church. Little comments here, little comments there. It's amazing. And my friends, we catch each other. Like there's even little things that have been said so frequently that I believe show things that we hadn't even known. And so I believe that an understanding by Christians of the feast seasons, the rest and joy of the Bible brings down anti-Semitism and brings an understanding on the side of Christians toward Jews, and perhaps a new view from Jews toward Christians. I believe it's a unity factor.
I would agree with you. And I also know that there are plenty of folks who are skeptical and don't agree with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
I talk to them frequently.
Well, I'm sure. What kind of objections do you get from the church writ large?
Yeah. So I would say from the Jewish side, many Jews don't even consider us Christians except to say, they're going to convert us or kill us. That's kind of the side of the Jews, right? On the Christians, you have that's law and Judaizing, and don't bring that thing that is called law, in my understanding, back to mind, because that's not appropriate for us now. I think the easiest answer I have for that is I'll never teach that way. I will always teach, if you want to go up to the banquet table and get the caviar and all the goodies, then help yourself. It's there, it's available, and it's yours. Is it required and you have to? I don't think even theologically it is. I believe it's a gift. It's like a treasure chest that's been sitting over in the corner that has our name written on the top. We can walk back and forth past that all our lives and not open it up and gather up the riches inside and be fine. On the other hand, we can pass by it one time, see our name, open it up, and gather the riches that are intended for us. So is it obligatory among the church? I don't believe so. Is it a gift waiting to be unwrapped? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is the thing, we do not have to argue about this. Does the law apply to Gentile? We don't have to argue. I love the way you put that. Mm-hmm. Here's what God has laid out here. We are invited to partake. Mm-hmm. And let's do it humbly, and let's do it in the way, here's a way that I have come to understand how I can have fellowship with and partner with my Jewish friends, is we believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We believe in his promises to restore all Israel, and through Israel, all the nations. We believe in a coming messianic age where Messiah, son of David, is ruling from Zion. The law goes forth, the Torah goes forth to all the nations. And all the nations are supposed to help Israel establish this. So, all right, the stumbling block, according to Isaiah 8:14, to both houses of Israel is the Messiah. Can we find ways, now that we recognize there's a stumbling block, can we find ways to cooperate and work even though there is that stumbling block? Because, and this is where I love your identity message, if I, as a Christian, a disciple of this Jewish person who I call Messiah, if I'm secure in my identity in him, my Orthodox friends who don't believe in Jesus as Messiah, that's not a threat to me. And I don't have to be a threat to them because they are secure in their identity. And we're all expecting the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to sort us out and correct us all in time. Does that make sense? Is that a healthy way to do it?
Yeah, well, I suppose, there's no attraction to somebody who's trying to force you to do anything, is there?
No.
So perhaps we've used methods within Christianity that aren't effective in the first place. So I would say those are worth setting aside and never revisiting in the first place. And could it be open doors for conversations? I guarantee that when we start to understand more about the faith of Jesus in the way that he understood it, there are questions that you have. When the translations of the Bible started going outside of Hebrew, Tanakh especially, and you had Jerome that was translating, he said, well, I need to go talk to the rabbis to ask them what this means, because I don't know what it means. And I have a feeling that if any of us as Christians had the task of translating we would be at a loss for some words too. And the reason why we would be at a loss is not because of lack of faith, but because of lack of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
So we know about the verse that says, my people perish for lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. That's where I believe we stand as Christians, because we haven't ventured to a place that is worth adventuring into because of fear and, well, I'm going to have to, I don't know, all the feelings that go along with that, right? I have to protect who I am, and, just kind of ridiculous feelings. When we come with an attitude of there's plenty, and the King of Kings has our back, he's for us, and he walks beside us. It's the same for our Jewish brothers and sisters. He sees them as the same. He's got their back and he walks beside them as well. And so we don't have to be in a fear state of well, I don't know, if I do this, then I have to protect this, or, there's really none of that. There's plenty of all the goodness that is needed to go around. And so pursuing the relationships in that way, even when it comes to Christians who are antagonistic toward things that are part of this heritage of Jesus, I believe that attitude is really that attitude that was the identifier for the first Christians, isn't it? They will know who they are by their love. So when we come at things with love, it breaks a lot of barriers along the way.
Well, that it does. That's actually, as I step back at it now and look through the New Testament, that's what I'm reading in, let's see, the remarks of Jesus, the letters of Paul and Peter. They're not calling for cut yourself off from these Jewish peoples. In fact, doesn't Paul say in Romans 11 something about don't cut yourself off from the root because the root supports you?
And don't be boastful, and don't think that you got it all together, and they don't. There's some great consequences of that attitude. Yes,
in fact. Now, taking from Romans 11 again, to go back to something that we Christians have always heard of, make the Jews jealous. Well, my friend Dean By at Return Ministries acquainted me with another way to read that. It's to make Israel zealous. So
absolutely.
What do you think of that? I mean, what zealous for what? And how do we do that?
Yeah. Well, I suppose, the way that I think about it is, as in Romans 11, there's these wild olive shoots that get grafted onto the existing tree. So we have these, as looking at the tree in our mind's eye, we see these existent branches that get all the nourishment, and that represents the early and oldest brothers and sisters in the faith, the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when I see that picture, I picture God turning around and seeing these kind of hopeless little sprigs that wouldn't even have a chance. And he goes around and he says, they're hopeless and without hope, without a future, without anything that would cause them to thrive. And he breaks them off and he puts them on to that very healthy tree with the big branches. And then he speaks to them and he says, you're here at the cost of some of those other other big branches. In other words, some of those big branches have been taken off for a time so that you could come on. Mm-hmm. And that verse makes me fall on my knees every time. Mm-hmm. Because somehow the Father made room for us at the expense of some of his firstborn sons and daughters, until a time, that chapter says, when he puts them all back on again. And that's zealousness. When they come back on and they see everything, the amazing stuff that God did, Tikkun Olam, he repaired the world. He brought the pagans that were just hopeless and caught in all the kinds of things that pagans get caught into, and he put them in his family. That's part of the Jewish promise too, is that the rest of the world comes in, and the rest of the world comes in because of the work of the Father, but also the paving the way by the older brothers and sisters. They showed the way. We wouldn't have even known there was a Messiah unless we were told by the early or the older brothers and sisters in the faith. They're the ones that even gave us a clue that there would have been a Messiah in the first place. So as you ask that question, I see the big branches getting put back on and celebrating, going, oh my gosh, we may have had a veil over our eyes for the period of time that we were broken off the tree. And we may have been over here off the tree for a while. But now that we've gotten back on and looked around to see what the Father has been doing in the meantime, oh my gosh. And I have a feeling that at that point they fall to their knees and say, look at the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He is magnificent in his ways. And at that point, the glory of the Lord covers the earth as the glory covers the sea. How does the verse go? It's exactly that thing I think they will experience. Yeah. So that excitement will come back, I believe, and that'll be part of the zealousness as they look at us and they go, oh my gosh, those were the hopeless ones. And look at them now. They know our Father.
Exactly. And, that's what Dean was getting at. And I have talked with a gentleman here in South Carolina who goes back every year, 3 times a year for the feast, because that's what the scriptures say.
Yes.
And he came from our side of the family, brought up in church, and now keeps Torah because, well, all right, it's there, it's riches for us. He gives me anecdotes of, being in, say, Madrid and about to get on an El Al flight, and the Israeli security airline employee says, why are you going to Israel? Oh, well, I'm going for Shavuot. Oh, well, I'm not going for Shavuot. Well, you should, he says. Next year, I'll see you there at the feast, right? That's making people zealous to do what, not just in their faith, but tradition, but this is what God commanded Moses for Israel. And by the way, it's what Jews throughout the centuries have stood firm on in the face of Christian persecution. And that's something our mutual friend Bob Odell has helped us understand.
Absolutely. I believe that in the time of disbursement and persecution, we can learn a lot about how that happened with Jews. How did they deal with disbursement and persecution? They hung on to a weekly event.
Yeah.
And they were even defined by a weekly event around the world by rulers of nations where they went. Those are the people, they get together every week. They get together and they pray and they celebrate. And then they take other times off on the calendar because they're celebrating at other times as well. I believe we can learn a lot. The times that we live in now are looking more shaky than they have ever in our lifetimes for generations, I would say. Second World War was clearly huge, but other wars have not really impacted this land. Even the Second World War, it impacted us in a way, but we didn't have war here, correct? I'm not saying that we're going to have war here, but I believe that other forms of difficulty are not so far away.
That's right.
And so how do we continue our faith? How can we learn from how those that have been around and in the relationship with the Father, our Heavenly Father, for 3,500 years, how can we learn from them about how to keep faith together during super persecuting times where Christians may not have it so easy? So I believe part of it is remembering the timeless traditions of Jesus. And so that's what Simcha Foundation does. We teach about these timeless traditions that bring joy and rest. And we also are creating what we call Simcha culture, which is a culture of thriving. So I mentioned earlier that I have a background in business and communications, and I also serve as an executive coach. So I coach leaders and businesses around this nation and some overseas. And so as I coach, one of the things that I talk about is creating and cultivating a culture of joy, both personally and within our own communities, whether that community is a household or friends around the block or friends at church or a Bible study group or another subset of church. So culture of joy, I believe, is also what keeps us intact as persecution comes. What is a culture of joy? Well, it's really integrating a lot of the things that we know, and I use as an executive life coach in terms of brain science and how we interact and continue in relationship no matter what the circumstances might hold around us. And I'd love to give you an example of that, if that'd be okay.
Oh, absolutely.
So one of the things that we do, I mentioned in the weekly Shabbat guide, as you learn a little bit about how to celebrate a weekly day of rest, we have in the Shabbat guide, there's a page dedicated to gathering together on that day. So you may gather together with a spouse, you may gather together with grandchildren, you may gather together with whomever is around that particular time. And we have a reading that you can read, 2 paragraphs, learn about what it is that was on the minds of the earliest Christians at that time, followed by some conversation starters. So you can actually have some meaningful conversation about biblical things that can transform your life. But we start all of that in gatherings with one question. And that question is, what are you grateful for this week? Why do we start with a question? What are you grateful for this week? Well, for the first reason, because you probably haven't gathered together in this way for a week because it's a special day, right? The Lord says that he set aside one day that's different from all the rest, and he called it Kadosh, holy, set apart. So by the time we get around to the next time of gathering for this day that's set apart and different from all the rest, called holy, we can ask the question, what are you grateful for this week? And when that question happens, we actually have relational circuits that begin to open in our brain. There's a relational circuit back in the amygdala, actually is affected when you become grateful. And soon you find movement to the prefrontal cortex, and relationships can start and keep up because you've begun to be grateful. Mm. And so as you gather around, hopefully at a table with food in front of you, when the pressure of the week is off, and you can ask the question, what are you grateful for? We know that a chemical brain action happens to cause you to be present at the table with other people that are gathered there. Sometimes we get caught up on that question for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour before we even move into the reading and the other conversation starters, because it's such a blessing to be at peace and at rest, and also just be relational in a way that we may not have had a chance to be that way throughout the rest of the week. So Simcha culture, a culture of joy, that's one of the things that's included in Simcha culture, and that's part of Simcha Foundation. So we have retreats. We've had several retreats so far. So we have retreats scheduled throughout the year, as well as travel to Israel. And those are all part of creating Simcha culture as we learn about these timeless traditions of Jesus.
I like that. I like that Simcha culture of joy. It's a whole lot better and more sustaining than being happy.
Different things altogether, right? Yeah. You know, those verses on joy are so encouraging. You know, for times when we feel like we want to give up or isolate or be alone or just quit, we can know that it's the joy of the Lord that gives us our strength. And it was literally joy that led Yeshua to the cross, so that the entire fabric of the universe would change when he died for the sins of the world. Joy is perhaps highly underrated and hugely important. And Simcha is joy, and that's what we're bringing back. It's time for it to come back. And if you talk about what is the Lord doing all over the earth today, I believe that he's going to teach us about his Simcha, his joy that is sustainable no matter what we see happen around us. So we can see anything happen around us and we can stay in joy. We can hear news that sounds devastating, like we won't be able to make it, and we can stay in joy because it's the Lord's joy, the same joy that took him to the cross. And I believe that as we emulate him, that's one of the biggest ways that we get to learn how to emulate him, is to entering into and swimming around in that place of joy that he's given us.
Amen. Well, Dr. Gayle Timberlake of the Simca Foundation, thank you for bringing some of your joy to the Reunion Roadmap.
My pleasure.
And once again, your website is?
It's www.simcafoundation.org. You can always also find it at simcajoy.org. And on there, you'll find the Shabbat guide. You'll find all sorts of other things. We've partnered with world-renowned artist Yoram Ranan and have some of his amazingly beautiful artwork, along with a lot of other things there. Join us.
Absolutely. Well, I will be taking a look. So, simcafoundation.org. Thank you again, Dr. Gayle. It has been a joy to talk to you.
My pleasure, Al. Thanks for having me.